Yeah, yeah, of course. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Antonia Zimmermann. I'm a sustainability reporter with Politico, covering one of the, what I would claim, hottest topics of our current time here in Brussels, and that's critical raw materials, the topic of our next session. Russia's war in Ukraine and the COVID-19 pandemic have alerted the EU to its dependence on third countries, and most notably China, for the raw materials it needs for green and digital transition tech. The European Commission drafted its response in record time, the Critical Raw Materials Act, and the file is currently under negotiation in both the Parliament and among member countries. So I'm really glad you can join us today for this very timely debate on how Europe can compete with its geopolitical rivals in the area of raw materials. So thank you very much for everyone joining us both in the room and online today. If you want to submit questions, you can do that through our Swapcard app. So that's either by scanning the QR codes that I'm sure you've seen in the room or by going on our event website. But before we get started with our discussion, I would now like to give the floor to our partner, Stefan de Bruyne, who is Director of External Affairs at SQM. Welcome.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I'd like to start you off with a personal anecdote. So it must be more than 10 years ago, in my role of selling lithium at that time to Asia, I landed one night in Beijing. And when we got out of the plane and out of the airport, there was this dense, dark, gray, heavy fog, which left a very acidic taste in my mouth and was stinging my eyes. Overnight, I became acutely motivated on sustainability. And so that has led me to my current role at SQM today. So I'd like to start you off also with a couple of quick facts. So SQM is the biggest lithium producer in the world, with a market share of around 20% globally. If you look at Europe, last year, Europe imported just over 22,000 tons of lithium carbonate and lithium hydroxide and other chemicals. The reality today is that the batteries are still being produced in Asia. And so when you look at Europe's market share globally, this 22,000 tons is about 3% of the global demand, which was last year more than 750,000 tons. So coming now to electric vehicles. Last year already, more than 13% of the vehicles sold in the world were electrified with a lithium-ion battery. And what is very striking is that last year car sales in Europe declined by more than 6%. However, EV sales increased by more than 15%. And so we're at this dawn of the European gigafactories, where Europe will produce its own batteries. And with that production, of course, comes the need for more materials. And electric vehicles hold tremendous promise, because when you look at the battery and how it drives the car, the metals and materials contained in that battery, they do not get burnt while they provide the energy to drive the electric car. However, we need to mine and we need to get those materials out of the ground, process them, and we need to do so in the most sustainable and in the most equitable way. And so there's no mining without impact. The real heart of the matter is then, how do we define the mining of the future? At SQM, we believe it's important to look at this in a holistic way and to do so in a horizontal way. Our vision is to become the most sustainable lithium producer in the world. President Boric of Chile a couple of months ago announced his national lithium plan, where he also speaks about sustainability, local value sharing, innovation. So for SQM, we are fully aligned with that. We know that we have already one of the lowest lithium footprints in the world. This is based on studies from ETH Zurich and Argonne National Lab. We are committed to becoming a net zero lithium producer by 2030. And what many people don't know is that already since 30 years, we are part of this very successful public-private partnership in Chile to produce lithium. SQM became the biggest tax contributor in Chile last year, contributing more than $5 billion to the state, and not only to the states, also to the region, to the municipalities where we operate, and to the indigenous communities where we are. I've mentioned also innovation. We last year also started to produce lithium sulfate. This is not coming from the brine, but it's coming from the salt stockpiles that we have in the salar, increasing our resource yield. Finally, we have announced also our plan for water-neutral lithium production, and this is based on direct lithium extraction, DLE, advanced evaporation technologies, reinjection, and seawater adduction. I've mentioned horizontality, so we are in a continuous dialogue with the communities surrounding our operation. We know that it's critically important for all our stakeholders and shareholders that we have an inclusive relationship with our neighbors. And so there is 5 communities in our area of influence. In Salar de Atacama, we have already reached agreements with 4 of them. We're actively working on more agreements, always focusing on shared social value creation. Horizontality also means being transparent. And so last year, 2 years ago actually, we made our environmental monitoring system publicly available. So any stakeholder that is interested in the parameters of our operation can go online, sqms.com, and check those values and come back to us with any questions or comments. Finally, being horizontal is also about accountability. And SQM was one of the first 5 mining sites in the world to undergo an on-site IRMA audit. IRMA is the most comprehensive and most rigorous mining assurance standard in the world. Our audit report will become publicly available, hopefully very soon. And that will be another tool to dialogue with our neighbors and our other stakeholders. We hope it will show that we are adhering to some of the highest standards in the world. More importantly, it will show us where we need to continue working to improve going forward. So coming back now to our panel and to Europe. The German resource agency, DERA, they estimate European demand to grow to 425,000 tons of lithium chemicals by 2030. They also estimate that about 100 to 150,000 tons of those could be produced domestically in Europe. That does mean, however, that for the gap of 300,000 tons, Europe will need to continue to rely on strong partners like SQM and Chile going forward. And so it's my honor to give the floor to the esteemed panelists. I look very much forward to the interesting discussion on this topic. Thank you very much.
To give a very warm welcome to our panelists. To my left is Matthias Buck. He's Director Europe at Agora Energiewende, a think tank, and I believe he joined us from Berlin today. And then we have Maivie Rutte, who's Deputy Director General at DG GROW at the European Commission. And I believe she's the only non-German on our panel today, which seems to always happen to me when I moderate, but not on purpose. And I'm also very happy to welcome Nicolas Beer, who's a German lawmaker at the European Parliament with the Renew Group, and who is currently leading the work on the Parliament's position on the Critical Raw Materials Act. I'd like to kick off this discussion with a very recent development. Some of you might know Germany, Italy, and France just yesterday announced they want to ramp up collaboration on critical raw materials and strategic raw material projects in particular. Now, I'd be very interested, maybe starting with you, Mavi, in your response to the announcement, because I think there's also been some member countries who've been saying, well, we're now looking at the Critical Raw Materials Act, we want an EU-level approach, we want more concerted action at the EU level. Now you see some countries going their own way. What is your response to that? Is that something we should welcome or be more careful about?
Well, I first of all think it's really great news that member states are now looking into the raw materials needs and are following at what we have set as this kind of really important political agenda of getting raw materials extracted, processed and recycled in Europe. In fact, if we look back to the famous Versailles Declaration already, important member states have shown their interest in being part and very much in lead of the raw materials agenda. So I see the most recent announcement now by Germany, France and Italy as a good example of actually member states really moving from the words to deeds and trying to get things from, let's say, drawing board towards more investments, national also strategies. And in fact, if you look at the Raw Materials Act, we propose coordination through a board, we call it Critical Raw Materials Board. So there will be, and there is already coordination provided through Commission, and there is going to be more ample opportunities through the actual implementation of the Act once the lawmakers, the Council and Parliament agree on actually how the whole shape is going to be agreed.
And yeah, let me maybe move to you Nicola. Yeah, do you think that the Critical Raw Materials Act, as we have it on the table right now, is doing enough to strengthen EU supply chains?
I think it's first important that we get such a piece of legislation because it sends a strong signal to what is needed. Of course, Parliament is discussing how to improve the proposal of the Commission on certain points, for example, to include as a fourth pillar also innovation via substitution, whether this is substitution of materials. I mean, we just heard in the introduction about the lithium. If we could replace lithium, we would not have to mine for it, but we could use maybe another material to produce batteries. I see, yes, this might be a disruptive innovation, but it's not impossible to think about that or to think about how to improve, for example, how we construct a battery or another product so that we can recycle easier and get more raw material out of recycling, so to avoid mining, which comes, as it was also mentioned out, always with implication and impact on environmental. And so this is a part which is very important all over the groups in the European Parliament. We want to reduce red tape. We want to emphasize also the strategic partnerships with third countries because we think this is really something we have to see in a holistic approach to have new partnerships with a lot of countries, whether this is in Southern America, Asia or Africa. But with a win-win situation on both sides, so that not only the mining, but also the refinement, the skilling up of people, the environmental improvement, the labor conditions get better. And that this is a sort of path we go within such a partnership. And there, I think it's good that we have the first countries coordinating. But I think especially for the third country approach, we should really try not to go one by one or three by three, but really to go on a European level, because there we will be recognized as the European Union, or we will not be recognized as a trustful partner. For the moment, the Chinese are already there. The question is whether we can be a better partner because there are more advantages to work with the European Union as a whole, and we should use the weight of the 450 million inhabitants here and citizens instead of going 27 countries all for their special partnership.
Yeah, I think some really interesting points that you've raised, and I think we'll try to come back to quite a few of them, especially the idea of third countries. But I think before we do that, I also saw you nodding when it came to the idea of substitution, to more emphasis being placed on innovation when it comes to securing our supply chains of raw materials. Do you get the sense that we're currently focusing on the right things, on is the way to go to say, okay, we want to, what exactly should we be focusing actually when we speak about raw materials and securing our supply?
Yes, thank you. So I think it was really interesting if we link the discussion on this panel to the previous discussion on the previous panel, because the Net Zero Industry Act and the Critical Raw Materials Act really need to work together. And so we need to think about what we have ahead as along the integrated value chains of the clean technologies. This is really important, from the raw material to the end product. And this is where, looking at the debate around the Net Zero Industry Act in particular, not so much the critical raw materials, I'm a bit concerned about losing the focus, losing the priority that we need. It starts in a way with, we would give a bit more focus and priority setting to the lead technologies and what are the targets Europe really wants to achieve, needs to achieve from a resilience perspective. That's one aspect of it. The second then, of course, is how much, what are the products that, the lead projects that we see in Europe. And there, of course, it is much better, and perhaps we follow the Chinese example, to focus on the big projects and not to have just every member state supporting their own national champion. And this is in a way the dynamic at the moment that is unfolding in the council discussion, not setting aside the debate we just heard about nuclear being included or completely deleting this annex to the Net Zero Industry Act that would give a focus on the net zero strategic technology. So I see it really linked, very much so. And then if you are very clear about your priorities, what do we want to achieve in terms of resilience thresholds in domestic manufacturing in Europe, then you look at the value chain, then you look at the solar PV value chain. We have some very high dependencies on China at the moment, not so much actually at the raw materials, but really at the processing and the refining. And so this is where we need to focus if we want to de-risk our relationship in that particular value chain. If you go to the wind value chain, it's mostly permanent magnets where we have very critical situation for scaling European production. So it really depends on the value chain, but in order to get it right, we need to link it, these two debates really together.
And so I mean, obviously the Critical Raw Materials Act and the Net Zero Industry Act are supposed to be linked. Do you get the sense that we're currently not taking the right approach? Because basically, I mean, what you're suggesting is we're starting by identifying, the resilience in specific, very specific supply chains, essentially, and then we're working, making our way backwards, basically. Do you get the sense that is not currently being taken into account enough?
I think there's a risk in the way the whole system is supposed to work. We don't really know yet what will be coming out of it, because the Net Zero Industry Act in particular, but also the Critical Raw Materials Act, is a bit of a black box. Yeah, so for the Critical Raw Materials, I think it's more specific. For the Net Zero Industry Act, it very much depends on the outcome of the dialogues between the Commission and the member states, how the prioritization will work, and what really will be the targets that we set for ourselves. So for me, it touches on the right points, fast-tracking the permitting, really getting projects to the start, but which projects, on which sectors, in which value chains, and what's the scale, and how do we cooperate around those projects is really very open at the moment.
I saw some responses from both of you, so maybe would you want to go first and respond to what we've just heard?
Well, let me take it perhaps a bit further indeed. First of all, not all the wisdom is only in the Net Zero Industry Act proposal or in the Critical Raw Materials Act. As we well know, Commission has been putting forward and legislating on a Green Deal already, for 2-3 years. And there are other political documents where very clear targets have been set for our climate neutrality. And now if you look at the Critical Raw Materials Act and the Net Zero Industry Act, these are rather now taking things to the implementation stage. Of course, the debates are still ongoing as to the level of ambition for both Net Zero Industry Act and the Critical Raw Materials Act in the Parliament and in the Council. But at least what we see so far is not well, at least that's my reading of it, is not an attempt to reduce the level ambition. I rather see it's the other way around. As we also heard from Nicola here, there is sometimes ambition to even, there is sometimes interest to even go beyond what we have put forward from the Commission side. So if we look at what is concretely in the Net Zero Industries Act, it puts forward technologies which are directly contributing towards transition towards basically renewable energy, plus of course decarbonization of the industries. And then the Critical Raw Materials Act translates it into what are the raw materials that we need for these technologies. And in the Critical Raw Materials Act, of course, we have targets. These targets are based on what we currently already extract or don't extract in Europe, how much we already recycle, and then we have our estimations based on both our joint research center work and, of course, what we get also from looking at other evidence, then projecting what are the demands in the future for these critical raw materials, where do we stand today with availability of these critical raw materials in Europe and elsewhere, and that's where it gets its targets of 10% extraction, about 40% processing capacities in Europe, and 15% recycling. And the important element for the third countries is to make sure that we are not dependent on just one single third country for these critically or strategic raw materials, and that's what you have seen. We have set a target of 65%, let's say upper limit of dependency in just one single third country.
Yeah, I'd also like to get your thoughts on this, and maybe just to narrow it down a bit more. I mean, Italy, France, and Germany yesterday also made it very clear in their position that they would hope for basically these targets that we've just heard to be set for individual strategic raw materials. So moving away from the level that we're currently taking, also acknowledging that obviously there's huge discrepancies between how feasible, you know, certain targets are. Is this something? Yeah. What is your take on that? And yeah,
let me first thank for saying that Parliament is again more ambitious even than the Commission, but I just wanted to emphasize that the ambition for Parliament, especially for me as a rapporteur, is not to go beyond the Commission, but to do it right. So to do it feasible and also to give the right signals, because, and this is always a little bit the impression when we speak too much about targets and benchmarks, especially for the Net Zero Act, that it comes out a little bit like a total planification. Our ambition, to use this word, is to give the right signals to the market, because I'm sure that there is a business case in that, and to make it easy for the private sector to go for these targets, but not because we are planning them and saying to them exactly how they have to do it. We set a framework which is also ensuring our environmental and social side. So all these framework we also use in our current legislation for the environmental and the social project, but that we just want by a quicker permitting process, by clear aspects in the framework to make it easier for the private sector to go there. So this is not a public sector totally approach, and this is especially not a planification approach, but to get the right signals out. And then I'm quite sure that the market will work. For the second question about the benchmarks, this is also a question a little bit of the signals. And therefore, the raw materials, as you saw already in my draft, we made another approach that we look into the increasing of the recycling for every raw material in combination with an aggregated approach about the whole list. So because you have another situation on lithium than on copper, and not reflecting that is for us not nearby to the problems on the ground and the problems for the business cases. So you cannot have the same increase for lithium as you can have for others. I mean, to set, if you have already recycling 40% of copper, you will never get to a 40% of lithium because it's quite rarer than for the copper for the moment, and so we try to combine this. But Parliament in the current situation is also to discuss whether we only go for the approach of the Commission to speak about a base of the consumption, which is projected, or if we also can introduce step by step a projection of using the amount of waste and the density of the raw materials within that waste, so that we really extract from waste, because everything you have extracted from waste, you do not have to extract from the soil.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a number of points that you've touched on there that I'd like to put to you, and I mean, I think there's obviously lots of the discussions that we've been having have been around, well, how do we create the right conditions to, well, reach targets, be they, you know, just indicators, or how do we set the scene right? And I think from what we're hearing from member states, there's also been, you know, some discussions around permitting and the provisions in the Critical Raw Materials Act and how realistic they are for countries to implement. There's been some discussions about, watering down the provisions relating to speeding up the permitting process. And I'd, you know, like to ask you, what do you make of concerns from countries that the permitting targets that we're currently setting in the Critical Raw Materials Act are not realistic?
Well, the permitting targets, of course, are put forward thinking in terms of really the climate urgencies that we are facing. And the administrative task of sorting out how do we get there, of course, can be at the first, maybe first sight a bit challenging, or maybe sometimes makes member states concerned whether they can deliver. But let us not throw it out too quickly. Our thinking is that there will be several processes that would help us. On one hand, we already see that member states differ a lot in the way they have currently organized this process. So one should start looking how the others are doing it and perhaps learn from this. Do we need to have companies run between 17 or 18 different offices? Or perhaps it can be brought together and there is one single, let's say, central coordinator within the member states that can help. So that's one thing. Secondly, you have seen also we put forward ideas of doing a bit of pre-clearance. So going to places where a certain member state can already look, maybe former mining areas, former industrial areas, where some of these checks can be done already, and then it's kind of a go-to area and things will go faster. We also, of course, encourage as much as possible to use digitization, have the databases digitalized, have at least an overview where even the deposits are in Europe. And frankly, this is also something where we are very much lacking information. Our investments in geological surveys in Europe have been also only at a level maybe half, even maybe 1/3 of what is normally done elsewhere. So we don't even know about our deposits and also the mining waste where a lot of extraction could still happen. So having this information available, doing pre-screening, actually auditing of these sites, organizing the work better, and then maybe also trying to see whether all the steps are necessary to do consequentially, or maybe they can be done in parallel. So we see many opportunities of really speeding up. And of course, what finally the Council and Parliament will decide as to the kind of timelines for permitting, we still need to see. But certainly there is great scope for improvement. And I underline one more time, it's not that we want to push for it just because we believe it's nice to have short deadlines. It's really in line with our targets to cut the carbon emissions and to come forward with technologies that needs these raw materials. So if it takes 7 years to get the permit, or sometimes even longer, we will be already in 2030. So we cannot really wait. This has to be sorted out. And I very much think that there will be ways of really getting ahead, looking at goodwill that now is invested in this sector.
Matthias, I see you nodding a lot. What is, in your view, what are the main obstacles to speeding up permitting in the EU? And also, I mean, one of them, just an additional question, one of the main concerns is obviously always, you know, when we speed up permitting, how do we reconcile that with sustainability requirements? So yeah, maybe some thoughts as well on how do you see that tension?
In my understanding, the real challenge is actually not, I would say Europe has pretty much done what it can do in order to simplify, streamline, accelerate permitting. The main challenges we have is to engage the people in the regions, the decision makers, the stakeholders in the regions, to really take the opportunity. This is my perception of the current situation where we are. And of course, you can accelerate very significantly permitting of an industrial project, of some renewable projects. It's absolutely no problem, fully consistent with our aspirations on nature protection. Also being inclusive, you can do one-stop shops, as we say, just streamline permitting processes, don't have 5, 6, 7 processes running in parallel or consecutively. But this, of course, requires the willingness of the governments to take this opportunity. But as importantly, in my view, we need to inform much better the population, I mean the people, about the opportunities, but also about what happens if we just go on doing as we're doing, because this is also not an option. And at the moment, what I'm missing in some debates, I'm from Germany, so I see how debates are developing there. I'm sometimes quite concerned about some of the messages that perhaps we can just continue doing as we want to do and then everything will be fine. No, it will be not be fine, as you were saying. And we really need to shift gear. There's an opportunity. It's not that the permitting, the acceleration and the integrity of the process cannot be done at the same time. It's just that it needs to be wanted, and you really need to engage with the stakeholders in the region to get the ownership.
I think both of you wanted to jump in, so
yeah, maybe if I just may add to something that I said, and I should have actually mentioned a very important element that we often now hear back from the authorities as well as industry, namely that over the last 15, 20 years, when Europe has not been so much doing mining and we have rather been closing down our extraction and recycling, we have lost a lot of the skills needed. And this actually is also part of the issue why in member states, maybe in their ministries, in their agencies, they don't even have people with the right training, the right expertise to even do this all the analysis that it takes for the permitting. So we also face actually quite substantial and rapid need to build up again these expertise capacities, the analytical capacities in the member states so that these permits could indeed be processed. So it's organizational issues, but it's also very much a need to quickly skill up the labor force, not only in the industries, but also in the public administration.
Yeah, but I mean, then it's also important to say that we have really a coherent approach because we are focusing on some strategic raw materials for some strategic projects or partnerships. So it's not about 1 million of permitting processes, it's really focused. And this is one of the reasons why we as a parliament, and I'm also as a rapporteur, I'm quite strong on not reopening the list, for example, because if I once open the list, then there is a big risk that not only for the aluminium discussion, but for sand, for coking coal or whatever, it's in the list, then we have a broad list, and then it will multiply the number of permitting processes. And so this is all together. I think we do a really good job if we focus on what is really strategic so that we have enough raw materials to use for the technologies we need for the Green Deal. and for the digital transition, and that afterwards, when we learned maybe also with these processes of the one-stop shop, of the case managers, of how we do environmental, social question in parallel also with the other questions which are in such administrative processes, and when we build up the skills, that then we can maybe use this as a best case experience also for other processes in other relations. But here, really to focus on a small number of materials for a small number of projects for a small number, which then we can really process as quickly as possible, because this is the important point for enterprises. Enterprises already know where such resources are. But for the moment, this was not a business case, because you had to wait for about 7, 10, or 15 years for a permit, so you invest somewhere else.
Maybe a very quick question, just because Nicola brought it up just now. Reopening the list, that's been a very hot topic. Yes or no?
Well, Commission has put forward the list already, and the list is already quite long, I must say. it is based exactly as Nicola correctly says. It's based on the assessment of the key strategic technologies and what it takes. And there are maybe a couple of elements I need to mention why the list is as it currently stands. We looked at the possibility of replacing, or let's say, putting something else, replacing this raw material with something else. Are there possibilities of using something else? And in the list, you find the raw materials which are very difficult to substitute. So these are the ones which are difficult to substitute. These are the ones where the demand is growing very rapidly. And the third element where we tend to be very dependent on just very narrow set or even just single supplier. That's how the technology or the methodology pretty much works, and that is why the list is what it is. But then again, we will see what Council and Parliament will come up with. We rather would say stick to the list. This has been based, but this is based on a methodology that is robust and evidence-based.
Yeah, we're sadly running out of time, but there's one last topic that I did want to get back to, and that's that you already mentioned at the beginning, our approach to third countries, right? We've talked a lot about permitting within the bloc, but obviously we can't do it alone. And I think a big topic of discussion has been, how do we approach third countries? How do we make a value proposition that's attractive to countries where, let's face it, China is mostly already dominating. Maybe let me start with you, Matthias. What do you think can the EU offer to countries, and what are some of the mistakes that we should avoid making?
We can offer a lot. I think this is the very clear starting point. We have a huge domestic market. We have a very clear demand that will grow into the future, and you can do the calculation. The Commission has done it, we have done it on the demand curve for clean tech deployment in Europe for us to go through all the way towards net zero. This has very clear implications for import needs that we have as Europe. So we are actually in a perfect situation to develop strategic partnerships with some countries that are currently perhaps not using their resources to the point they could use. And then the question is, what do we have to offer except just please take it out of the ground and bring it to us, or let us ship it to us? And I think there Europe has a lot to offer. We can enter into long-year strategic partnerships. It should be more than just a trade agreement, in my view. We do have some, in the context of the climate negotiations, some new, let's say, models of partnering between the global north and the global south, which we call just energy transition partnerships, where it's really about helping the partner countries to also develop their own transformation pathways and to empower them, build capacity, help them to also go the way to net zero. If you look around, we have not only Europe, of course, we have a very clear commitment to move towards net zero emissions, but 70% of global emissions at this moment are under net zero commitments. This is amazing from a climate protection perspective, but of course, only very few of those countries having those commitments are actually fully able to see it through, as we are able to see it through. So there's a massive opportunity for Europe to enter into strategic partnerships that go beyond just extracting something on the other side.
And Nicola, I mean, you've been also quite vocal about the idea that we shouldn't require third countries to comply with our standards from the get-go, but rather help them to, reach human rights and sustainability standards. How do you, with that approach, how do you guarantee we'll actually, get there, as in we'll actually guarantee that these standards then are eventually implemented in third countries?
By transfer of knowledge and technology. I mean, if we really would only look out for those countries who have already our own standards, then there will be very few. And the idea is just to help also such partners to develop the standards up to the level we have already. So have the ambition to do it by helping them in skilling people, so having the technology and the knowledge, by, for example, when we open mines, that the working condition, that the environmental conditions and also the condition for the local people are better than they are for the moment. Because to be quite blank, for the moment, we import it and we do not care how they are mined, more or less. And now to be responsible in a form of win-win situation partnership, really to develop better conditions on all the different levels we care here in Europe is important. Then we have a better situation globally wide. We use the technology not only here in Europe, but we can also use it in our partner countries. We will have growth, and so for prosperity also in such countries, so that the added value is not like in the Chinese style, just mining the raw materials, then getting it to a port and up to the refining capacity somewhere else in China, but that the refining is also done within our partnership in those countries on the ground, so that we have really a win-win situation, that we have the same level playing field for us as partners. And I think this really can play out also the Chinese strategy with a European responsible and trustworthy partner.
Maybe, sadly, we're running out of time, but if you would want to just add a few last thoughts on...
Yeah, indeed, 2-3 sentences. First of all, Europe has to go together, exactly like Nicola said, not each country separately to confuse others, we go together. Secondly, it's already happening. As Europe, we have recently signed this memorandum of understanding with several countries, well, actually 5 is signed, another 5 is under preparation. And thirdly, in order to make sure that the raw materials from third countries do not enter our market without taking due care of social and environmental concerns, we have introduced in the Act environmental footprint requirement. But the idea is that we have a methodology and we have the right to actually check how the raw materials elsewhere are produced before they enter European market, so that indeed we also help raise a bar with these countries with whom we work, and we add value to their industries or their economies locally. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this very lively discussion. I'm sure we could have gone on for much longer, and I think that's always a good sign that there's lots still to discuss, and hopefully maybe some of these discussions can be continued over lunch, which is what we're moving to now. So you're all very welcome to join our networking lunch, and then I'd kindly ask you to be back in this room at 2:20 for today's second stream, which will be focusing on trade. And thanks again for our great panelists today.
Thank you.
This is an age of disruption, of profound revolutionary change.
What we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors.
The only thing that you really push forth is the truth.
You don't see many women represented when it comes to the decisions as to how to handle the pandemic.